It's a bit of a fragile construction. Well, anyways, before I start to present what I've prepared, I would like to express my gratitude to Johnson, whose generosity, not only in these days, but also and particularly in these days, has really been extraterrestrial. And I think the magnitude of Johnson's generosity can probably only be compared to the magnitude of his modesty. And I'm saying this on purpose because it is in fact partly due to his modesty that I find myself in the position of giving this talk. For most of the ideas that I will be presenting today have been developed in close collaboration with Johnson, partly as an attempt to come to terms with the great variety of positions that Johnson has worked with and promoted throughout the years, both as a gallerist and as an international curator. Can you hear me well? Is that good? Our discussion focused on the quite diverse institutional landscape of Chinese art, which had struck me quite intensely as a total outsider to the Chinese art scene when I first came to China a few years ago. And with our discussion, we tried to sketch the institutional landscape of contemporary Chinese art and to develop a methodology for intercultural dialogue. With an institutional approach, we seem to be well prepared, as it seems to be particularly useful to focus on the institutional particularities, to focus both on the cultural specificities and on the social embeddedness of specific artistic practices without sticking to overarching meta-concepts of art other than the very institutional character of art as such, and thus to avoid any essentialism which can then of course be used to generalize culturally particular positions. In that sense, I also think, and I think it was a fruitful discussion for several reasons, for instance, for that reason, it can be used as a corrective for some of the flaws of the current global arts discussion, which I would also like to present as an opponent to sharpen some of the edges of our own discussion. So-called global art poses challenges to the theories and methodology of art scholarship and has also allowed for an increased interest in Chinese art in the West. Global art, on the one hand, appears as a huge hubris, transgressing the possible expertise of any academic context. Its key theoreticians have, on the other hand, been very careful not to define global art all too rigidly, to avoid any definition that would eventually favor any region-specific art practice. Hans Belting, for instance, one of the German protagonists of the global art discussion, has, in the debates on global art, paradigmatically limited himself to the following two defining elements. Without, as I said, any specific shared aesthetic properties, different global art practices are identifiable by these two aspects, namely first, having been produced as art and being contemporary. The intentions of the global art discourse are honorable, and the interest in a smooth form of scientific dialogue and of artistic exchange is understandable. It has, however, produced its own pitfalls and contradictions, which are, in many cases, quite the opposite of its original claims. 5 main problems can, to my mind, be identified. Firstly, the conceptual widening of the field of art has de-differentiated the understanding of art, whereas it remains highly implausible to which extent such a de-specified conception of art, something that would be globally applicable, can still be sufficiently distinctive to be of any descriptive value. Global art's descriptive approach, however, to the various locally specific artistic practices, secondly, leaves aside the question of the specific normative framework of art, as opposed to just normal cultural practices, which had been emphasized by the specific analyses of the institutional history of Western art, as for instance in the field theory of Pierre Bourdieu, or the art theoretical context of avant-gardism and institutional critique, such as I was thinking of Peter Bürger and the October Group. Third, the sociologically unspecific focus on the various forms of global visual production quite strongly resembles what Karatani Kojin has coined aestheticentrism, a form of bracketing of the social and economic preconditions of artistic practices. It thereby iterates, pretty much as Karatani has emphasized with its term of aestheticentrism, an Orientalist desire of the other in an aestheticist form. All these beautiful shapes. Fourth, by focusing on the apparently global conditions of artistic practices that aren't actually quite so global yet, global art discourse runs the risk of merely confirming the expansion of the global art market without taking the specific hegemonic preconditions into consideration that actually structure these respective markets. It thereby confirms a situation of highly unequal preconditions of competition on a Western-style art market turning global. Fifth and last, the often repeated pre-assumption of global art scholars that the Cold War, a world of competing economic and ideological blocs, has ended around the years 1989 and 1991 can, and to my mind, should be disputed. Not only that the scandalizing logics of discourse that characterized the rhetoric of the Cold War are still intact throughout the world, the alleged end of the Cold War is also particularly implausible for the two Korean countries and other East Asian lines of conflict involving China and Vietnam, and of course also the ALBA region in Latin America with Cuba and Venezuela at its center. Furthermore, and regardless of the fact whether the model of globalization and the end of the Cold War adequately describes the present geopolitical situation, one might also want to wonder whether a globalized world of multinational companies, market freedom, and the respective visual variety of, to quote Marx, an immense collection of commodities, end quote, is any desirable. In our discussion, we started to come up with an alternative model which I would like to suggest as an alternative to these flaws as well. Our interpretation of the Chinese situation avoided these problems of a specific type of global art discourse and focused on the institutionally specific landscape of three different forms of contemporary Chinese art production. Such a differentiating view on the institutional landscape of Chinese art allows, to our mind, to my mind, to take A, the specific political situation of China in a no man's land between nationalism, communism, and hypercapitalism into account, and B, to differentiate between various understandings of art and their specific normative apparatuses, institutional landscape that imply, that produce their own normative standards from within. C, such an embedding of the specific art practices in the ideological political situation of their countries, of their specific country, avoids any aestheticizing, or as Karatani would have said, aestheticentrist fetishism. Wherever we find it, art can be analyzed as an element of and rooted in social force relations and their respective institutionalizations. Inspired partly by Walter Benjamin's triangular approach to modern art, focusing on the unity between medium, distribution, and, in his case, the decline of authorship, and also by Danto's and Pierre Bourdieu's emphasis on the constitutive importance of discourse, we identified four main criteria to distinguish between the institutional landscapes that shape and constitute the different artistic practices. These are the medium and the status of the object, the conditions of display and of collecting, the question of authorship and the types of expected benefits, and last, the question of lineage and education, and thus of academic representation. These conditions of collecting and presenting art, of staging authorship, and of passing on the logics of this practice in institutionalized academic practices served as a grid for our discussion to outline these specificities and overlaps between the three dominant regimes of art in contemporary China. It also supported our initial observation that the Chinese situation is not only characterized by one art world, but by three parallel and partly interwoven practices of art, which are then, of course, this has already been mentioned by Gao Ximing. Actually, I should have mentioned Gao Ximing more explicitly because he's been an important part of all of our discussions. I don't know. Sorry about not, having been more explicit about that. So these three different paradigms or coexisting logics of valorization, logics of artistic practices, and their respective institutionalizations. This threefold situation seems to be special to this Chinese situation in various ways. whereas most countries of the global south have vivid scenes of craft and of traditional cultural and artistic production that are not necessarily linked or even aiming at any international audience. It is, and in Western European countries, we find parallel practices of, landscape painting and pastel painting galleries in some, vacation areas such as Tuscany or the Provence that are also not clearly defined by their relation to the professional and institutionalized art world, with, however, quite explicit references to 19th century role models of artists. The Chinese practices coexist with the advanced art forms of contemporary museums and the related galleries, and they are also fully institutionalized in academic landscapes. So all these three artistic regimes in China are equally institutionalized, even in the same academic institutions, and can equally refer to somewhat manifest systems of social valorization. In all the three cases, there are specific social practices, habits, and organizations of producing, distributing, exhibiting, and teaching art. So was our assumption. The figure of the three, of course, also has various symbolic dimensions. As indicated before, this way of counting is inspired by the geopolitical manner of speaking about three worlds, the first, the second, and the third world, the paradigm of the free market-oriented Western democracies, state socialism, and the so-called third world of developing countries. This threefold situation is, of course, emblematic and symptomatic for the general situation of contemporary China, with its radical movement towards capitalist modernization, which is confronting remnants of traditional culture in the terminology of Chinese communism. It could therefore also be discussed as a model case for assessing the general development of contemporary China, and I'm sure that we are going to discuss this in more detail with more expertise than the one that I would have. Let me shortly go through these three paradigms along the lines of the four criteria. To us, it seemed important to understand the specific traditions of genre and media in light of the respective social functions that they have to serve, which also defines the status of the object itself. Here we find three competing logics of the global platform as it is characterized by its experiments with imagination, clearly not restricted to any specific medium, but with strong allies, particularly in the field of video art and performance. Whereas socialist art seems to aim at the very formation of social life, and a politicized understanding of media, which is then linked to the idea of the figurative, which then again transgresses the specific object of the art world and migrates into the everyday, thinking of propaganda ashtrays even, and endlessly reproduced woodcut prints. Interestingly, this predominance of the everyday, albeit in a different fashion, had already characterized the traditional platform, where it meant to cultivate the self along the lines of certain rules of conduct, such as, and Johnson has invested a lot in reconstructing this tradition, such as in the Confucian tradition of Li, rules of conduct and a certain ethics of aesthetics, a certain style, a certain pattern of behavior. Here, in this line of tradition, we particularly also find the predominance of the written word, which Johnson, of course, had pointed out with his specific narrative of the power of the word in his Power of the Word exhibition, from which most of my visual material is taken. These different functions of the respective media practices clearly demand their own respective spaces. Here, too, three competing logics of both collecting and exhibiting can be identified. Whereas, again, the Western platform is, and not only in China, organized by the logics of private appropriation through commercial galleries and individual collectors, combined with the internationally oriented museums and biennials, it is quite interesting that socialist, could also say socialist realist, painting and woodcut prints were, and particularly so during the first years of the Cultural Revolution, as I learned from Johnson, displayed in contexts that were either made to serve or were even immediately identifiable with, more often than not, state-organized public space. Billboards and journals are the distinctive distributive organs next to the annual national exhibitions with their respective explicitly political agendas. The traditional literati practice, again, Johnson's exhibition on the yellow cube is quite inspirational and important here, classically finds itself displayed in Chinese garden landscapes. It is thus also appropriated privately, but in somehow semi-private surroundings in which the outside and the interior correspond. The most important difference between the three respective art worlds, however, might be the implicit structure of benefits, the implicit structure of what it promises to gain. So the implicit structure of promised benefits for the protagonists. And clearly the global platform promises global reputation and monetary benefits guaranteed by international copyright laws, by which it sanctifies an extended will to originality. Within the socialist paradigm, these promises cannot easily be given, while, however, national reputation, coupled with political privilege, can be striven for. There are again interesting overlaps between the traditional platform, both with the global and the socialist platform. One might want to emphasize its radically individual focus, which is, however, not so much a strive for individual originality, but rather for individual perfection along the lines of learned paradigms of craft and skill. Here too, access to ruling castes was classically guaranteed without directly financial benefits in a system of symbolic valorization, quite similar to the socialist platform, if you want to call it that. One of the main arguments that allows to speak about three parallel art worlds instead of merely one art world in the Chinese context is, as I indicated before, that all these three respective logics of Chinese art are equally and continuously taught on the level of state-supported, i.e. publicly legitimated academic institutions. In spite of the quite radically different style of teaching and of learning, indicated here by the italics, they are even in many cases taught at one and the same school. At about 10 major art academies in China, the teaching relates explicitly to the global art discourse and teaches it in special departments, for instance, as we all know, at the School of Intermediate Art at the China Academy of Art in Hangzhou. We are all to some extent inspired by its lively discussions. Video art classes and video art departments fulfill the same task, but so is the tradition of socialist realist painting represented at contemporary Chinese academies of painting, printing and sculpting, still to be found at a great number of national academies. I was very astonished when I came to China in 2011, and I was really fascinated by it actually, with the amount of contemporary productions in that field, in the field of socialist imagery, when I saw some of the exhibitions in praise of the 90th anniversary of the Communist Party in China in the big museums, such as the Shanghai Art Museum or the Zhejiang Art Museum in Hangzhou, in which actually some of the teachers of the China Art Academy of Hangzhou, in this case, and of the local art academies, could present their recent works, their contemporary works in the style of socialist realism. And what goes for socialist art, of course, also goes for the traditional platform. Ink brush painting, landscape painting, and calligraphy departments occupy just important spaces at contemporary Chinese art academies. Probably this is not a very interesting observation for most of you, but I was again very surprised and astonished by this experience, that there are indeed competing and parallel logics institutionalized at the same kind of academic institutes. The question therefore remains which future prospects one can think of for this, at this point somewhat peaceful coexistence. And I can mainly think of three different ways along the lines of which one could speculate about the future. The history of Chinese art has already seen a number of fusions between the different artistic paradigms. The whole exhibition is to some extent also an example for that. One could easily interpret these fusions as politically overdetermined aesthetic conjunctures. Three alliances of the three paradigms would then be possible. I'm speaking about hegemonic alliances, so dominant lines of definition, of the power to define. Communist China, of course, has been very active in appropriating styles and genres of the pre-modern and literati tradition. The importance of, say, a specific version of Mao Zedong for the history of calligraphy and the use of woodcut prints throughout the Cultural Revolution, beautiful examples in the exhibition, have probably been the most influential. With the 85 movement, major elements of Western avant-gardist developments, and very beautifully collected and presented by Gao Ximing for the 85 exhibitions just a couple of months ago, have been, with the 85 movement, major elements of Western avant-gardist developments have been integrated into a Chinese context, and maybe also some of the anti-institutional revolts of that time could also be interpreted in relation to the economic developments of that time, new market policy and new pragmatism that also introduced a new link between communist ideology and the Western paradigm. In any case, one could think of a certain kind of publicly oriented avant-gardism, a representative form of relational aesthetics or something alike, as the aesthetic correspondence. It makes a lot of sense to assume that the restoration of Confucian ethics in the context of New Asian values and Singapore-style authoritarian market economies will also lead to a restored interest in national histories, traditional values, and the biopolitics of individual balance and well-tempered contemplative subjectivities. To some extent, I think, and I hadn't known when I prepared this, that Zhu Jie is actually here, it is this use of traditional techniques of self-perfection which is to some extent, as I said, ironically referred to in the work of Zhu Jie, in which, as you can see, I should have been, no. In which, as you can see, the actual text that is rewritten over and over again finally, ultimately disappears. The work is actually also to be seen upstairs. Taking into account the immense power of capital to create, as Marx and Engels formulate beautifully in the Communist Manifesto, a world after its own image, quite nicely the use of the term image corresponds to what I'm trying to say, and to regard capital as an all-integrating machinery, a leveler, as Marx calls it in Capital, most of the overlaps and interrelations between the three platforms appear as effects of the commodity machine's capacity to inclusion, over, let's say, rewriting and in the end annihilating the differences in the inner logics. The global platform has indeed integrated very many aesthetic forms of both the socialist and the traditional platform with major success on the global art market. This could seem to be an argument for everything turning into the same. But one must not forget that commodity production is characterized by, and I've quoted this before, immense accumulation of spectacle. I have not actually quoted this, but the Marxian version, this is the Debordian version, by an immense accumulation of spectacles, which is not to be misunderstood as a uniformity in appearance, but as a uniformity in its inner logic. The expansion of the logic of the international platform would therefore rather be an expansion of the logics of autonomous artworks based on principle of performative originality and imaginative experimentation, rather than of a specific aesthetic type of imagery. This, however, would also mean that styles of socialist realism or classical landscape painting would be turned into something quite radically and essentially alien to the context in which they had originally been produced and to which they had originally belonged. I think that, and I mean, I'm not the right person to give a proper analysis of these works, but I think it is quite self-evident in works like the one of Feng Mengbo, in which socialist realism is not just transformed by transformers in a literal sense, transformers, but also in which the inner logic of socialist realist work disappears due to institutional constraints which structure the reception, an automatic and predetermined sense of irony. A last interpretation, and to my mind this would be the most productive and probably the most interesting interpretation of the relation between the three parallel worlds, or prospect for the relation between them, is suggested by Ernst Bloch's idea of non-synchronism. In his reflections on non-synchronism and the obligation to its dialectics, that's the name of his text, Bloch has suggested a certain necessary presence of the forms of the past in the imaginary of the present. As Bloch defines, I quote, and you find the quote on there, The objectively non-synchronous is that which is far from and alien to the present. It includes both declining remnants and, above all, uncompleted past, which has not been sublated, sublation, the idea of Aufhebung, which means to keep, to elevate, and to overcome, which has not yet been sublated by capitalism. The so-called objectively non-synchronous is thus a part of the past that the present keeps bringing back up in whatever distorted forms, because it cannot resolve the inherent challenge that it had once presented. In other words, and this is my conclusion, precisely if China fully succeeds to integrate into the cultural logics of the world market by eliminating both of its pasts, and if thus the internal logics of the Western platform will turn out to be the only one dominant, then it might well be possible that the repressed desire of a well-preserved cultural heritage and of a communist appropriation of modernity keeps reappearing for precisely that reason. Seen from a Western perspective, the art world is pretty much the right place for such an emancipatory desire of bringing back the repressed, even though precisely these desires keep getting disappointed by the art world's own inner market logics. Let us, and this is really my conclusion, interpret the unfortunate and quixotic king of Kowloon, we've seen some of his work upstairs, as a reminder and a remainder of these unfulfilled pasts. Thank you very much.